Does your family ever get exasperated with you for stockpiling such things as paper towels, bottled water, or toilet tissue? Well, they certainly can't object to you stockpiling money. Silver, the only money recognized by the U.S. Constitution, and your first 10-ounce bar of pure silver can be had at spot price with no premium by going to sdbullion.com/rp. And when you buy it that way, you'll be supporting Reluctant Preppers as well by going to sdbullion.com/rp. Thanks.
This is a quick update to thank you for building our number of patrons to 70 and growing on patreon.com/reluctantpreppers.
Soon, when we reach 100 active patrons, we're going to start sending out a 1-ounce U.S. Silver Eagle each and every month to one active subscriber, so you don't want to miss out on that.
Please help us grow by subscribing today at patreon.com/reluctantpreppers.
As a responsible person with growing concerns for your privacy and personal liberty, you want to know where we're headed and what you can do about it. We ask the experts what you need to do to take prudent and responsible action to safeguard your family's wealth and well-being, and what basic first steps will help you to be aware and prepared. ReluctantPreppers.com.
Welcome back, Reluctant Preppers. We have a returning guest tonight who is very popular with our guests. Wayne Jett is the author of The Fruits of Graft, and he's also the founder of ClassicalCapital.com. Wayne, thank you for joining us again here on Reluctant Preppers.
Thank you, Donegan. Very happy to be back with you.
You recently penned an article about trumping the Fed, and we've been following your thoughts with some interest over the past couple of months about Trump's progress and perhaps some of it behind the scenes at draining the swamp as he promised to do during his campaign. Some people are quite glad for the steps that they are seeing and the indications that we're hearing about. Other people seem quite frustrated that they aren't seeing more progress, and I've seen recently a kind of a litany of all kinds of different actions people wish Trump were taking but aren't seeing enough action in their minds, and I suppose that's always going to happen. But if you could take us into your trumping the Fed discussion and why you think it's important that we need to understand about financial changes that are coming.
I'll be happy to do that. I wrote a piece a week or so ago called Trumping the Fed that basically looked at the financial position of the Fed and just how precarious it is in terms of the idea that the Fed somehow is a safe place for us to be in terms of the handling of the American, U.S. or world reserve currency. It is far from that, and we can look at a few of those little aspects of it. But first, I'd like to just make a point that the Fed is a particular kind of thing. It is, yes, it's a corporation, but it is something much more significant than that. My view of how the Fed ought to be seen by Americans is it is the fortified outpost of a foreign power that has conquered our nation and is here occupying and exploiting us. It has been that from the very first day it was created. It had more limitations on it when it was first created, but it has the bit in its teeth, as they say in the horseman language, and it is doing whatever it wishes. It certainly makes no bones about it that it will not permit an audit. It has never done so. We do not know how it operates. We have no basis for thinking that what the Fed does has anything to do with what its so-called Board of Governors states to the public. In large part, the Federal Reserve, its open market committee, is really simply subject to reporting what the open market desk does, which is at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. As far as I can tell, it does what it wishes, reports those transactions to the Open Market Committee, and those minutes or notes or actions are simply rubber stamped by the Board of Governors whenever they meet. Now, in that circumstance, They have the ability to do whatever they want and tell us anything they want, and we will never be able to establish that they are or are not doing what they say they're doing. Certainly, I've written quite a number of things in the past over a period of years to indicate that what they say to us is a long way from what they are really doing. For example, the overnight rate that they say presently they use as the primary tool for determining their dollar policy and for regulating the economy.
Right.
Now, I have made the case that it is impossible for them to do that simply on the basis that it is impossible to write a mathematical equation containing anything about the economy and that interest rate and show the relationship between that interest rate and what the economy does, or what the amount, the number of dollars that go into the economy will be based upon the interest rate that you set. So that is a subterfuge, and the subterfuge that they are pulling is, in my opinion, the real purpose of that overnight interest rate is to set that benchmark rate as the basis upon which the big banks, the Wall Street banks, will all set their interest rates the same level. That way they can do that. They can fix their interest rates without competing, and they can do it simply on the basis that all of them set at the same rate above that so-called overnight rate. Now, in that circumstance, I mean, what are we talking about here? We're not talking about an institution that has the best interests of the American people in mind. It simply is not the case. They have a board of governors that does the politics of facing the public and talking about how they're going to do this and help that. And even at that, even their announced policy is preposterous in terms of the approach that they take of putting people out of work in order to fight inflation. That's the Phillips curve. That's their theory. That's their doctrine. And it is nonsense, and it does great damage to the economy time and time again whenever they do this sort of thing. And so anybody who thinks that there is security and feeling of comfort in staying with the Fed, I simply am saying to you, I do not feel that feeling of comfort in any respect whatsoever, and I don't think other people should either. We ought to be looking for a way to get out from under this tool of the ruling elite. A global ruling elite own the Fed. It is a private corporation. The majority stockholder basically is the Rothschild family. The Rockefellers are very big. There are other families that own those major big banks, and they control the Fed because even the Rothschilds have reputedly something like 55-56% ownership of the entire stock of the Fed. Now, in that circumstance, let's look at what the Fed is in terms of its operations and financial institutions, its relations to us.
All right.
It puts out paper that it's printed, and with the help of Congress saying that that paper is legal tender for all debts, public and private. That paper they put out, they call a Federal Reserve note. Note meaning a promissory note by which they are obligated to pay us something later that will be equal to what this supposedly is used to buy. In other words, its value they're promising to deliver to us, but just use this paper instead until we get there. And so that paper is then used to buy all sorts of assets. And yet they are permitted to manage the amount of paper they put out in such a way that it becomes worth less and less and less and less over the years.
Certainly true.
And once we get to the end of their cycle, it will be worthless, and they never have to pay. And yet, in the meantime, they've been able to put out as many of those into their own pockets as they wish, by billions, by the trillions, and buy hard assets all over the world. Now, they know what their game is, and I can assure you, when the wheelbarrows have to be used in order to carry around the money that you want to buy a loaf of bread with, they're going to have all of their dollars already invested by having bought land and gold and silver and houses and everything you can think of, so that they have hard assets, and the people who have the paper are the ones who worked all these years and saved all that money they thought was going to help them in their retirement or help their children or achieve their dreams in the world. They're the ones that are going to be holding the wheelbarrows and wishing it could get a loaf of bread for it. Now, okay, so we've got that circumstance. Let's look then at what the Fed's financial position is right now. They have financial statements of a kind. The information they want to tell us about is on their website. And so you can look it up, but essentially what they say, as we know, their monetary base, the number that I look at and think is the most important, because it's the number of the money that they put out, and then the economy works with it, and there are other numbers to measure, but the monetary base seems to me to be very important. And since August of 2008, when the monetary base was about $845 billion, that's $845 billion monetary base as of August of 2008.
Is that the same as what people refer to as base money?
Monetary base is what I call it. I think that's what you're probably referring to. But since then, they have quintupled the amount of dollars between 2008 and 2018. 10 years, it's 5 times as many. They have presently $4.35 trillion in the monetary base. Now, can we say that the economy has quintupled in size? Not anywhere in the imagination of anybody is it possible to say that.
Right.
And that's where they stand presently. And why haven't we seen the wheelbarrows carrying dollars so far? Because in large part, I think, they have required at least the regional and local commercial banks, they basically have been required to keep their reserves, their deposits with the Fed. They've enlarged the reserves, and so it's held out of the economy and so forth. A lot of it is in foreign countries. But nevertheless, 4.35 trillion, they've got a monetary base now 5 times as much as we had 10 years ago.
Okay.
Now, on that basis, remember what I said, that those dollars are promissory notes in which they are promising to pay this. And so they've promised to pay 4.35 trillion, and they haven't paid it yet. And so how can we be sure that they're going to have the money to pay, or the assets to pay us, when it comes time? Okay, what have they got on their balance sheet? They've got $2.4 trillion in U.S. bonds, federal debt. And how often have you heard people talking about how the smart thing to do for the U.S. Treasury is let's just default on those bonds and basically stick it to China and all those other countries that have bought them up too. Well, the American people and every dollar they've got depends upon the ability of the Fed to pay the value of those dollars. And the circumstance that we have with the Fed's balance sheet, if they hike interest rates, say 2 or 3 more percent, what are those bonds going to be worth? The $2.3 trillion that have been issued with very low interest rates.
That's right.
They're not going to be worth $2.3 trillion. And so you're going to have a very big hole punched in the Fed's balance sheet in terms of its ability to say that it can meet its debts. What it has presently on its balance sheet is it shows that it has a net worth of $39 billion.
That sounds like peanuts compared to the numbers we've been talking about.
It doesn't show all of its assets. It shows some. It shows federal bonds, as I said, U.S. bonds, $2.4 trillion. It shows mortgage bonds of $1.8 trillion. And so that comes up to a total of $4.2 trillion. And they are getting close to the 4.35, and so they've got supposedly some other assets. We don't know what they are that take that. But look at what happens if, for example, there were default on U.S. bonds. What would interest rates do? They would go through the roof. What if, for example, that happens? What happens to mortgage bonds? Interest rates go through the roof, the mortgage go through the floor. You have an exposure at the Fed of $4.3 trillion in round numbers on its U.S. bonds and its mortgage bonds, and both of them in our present national and world economic environment are high risk. We have many people saying the U.S. Treasury, U.S. government can't possibly pay the debts that it's raised.
Right.
And so we have a Federal Reserve that at best says its net assets are $39 billion. That is about 0.8% of what it owes. And that could be wiped out in a moment with a half-point interest rate increase. So if people are looking for comfort in the idea that we've had an occupying force in our country for the last 100 years, 105 or thereabouts, I think they better look elsewhere. And so therefore, I feel very comfortable in saying that the best thing we can do is end the Fed as quickly as possible and as soon as possible, but on the basis of a careful plan that allows us to get on sound ground at the outset and do it at a time that is before the Fed has completely collapsed and we're carrying dollars in wheelbarrows.
Right.
As the great German government people did less than a century ago, and as Venezuela is doing right now, and others as well, these fiat currencies collapse, and they do it on a regular schedule so that those who have issued the fiat currency, the financial powers, run away with the value of people's labor and products for the past century. And they've done it primarily since 1971, when we finally went completely away from the gold standard. But we really abandoned the gold standard. FDR did it in 1933 when he said Americans can no longer change the dollar for gold, which had been their right even since the Fed started up until then. Cut the box right out from under us right then, and the dollar became an illusory promise, only as good as the confidence in it, and certainly the rest of the world has lost confidence in it. The major countries of the world, other than America, the ones that can do so without getting in our gun sights, as several have in the past 20 years and have come out the very worst for it. I'm talking about Iraq wanting a gold dinar, Libya wanting a gold currency for Africa, and so forth. So that's where we are with the Fed, and getting around to the point that you began with as to the president and the administration presently. I think there have been good signals. I certainly interpret the circumstance as being that the president is moving toward what my objective is: get rid of the Fed as soon as possible, reset the dollar, reset our currency, arrive at a currency design that is honest and is open and maintains a stable value for the currency on a basis that can be done continuously over our lifetimes, our children's lifetimes, our country's lifetime. So that takes arrangements to be made.
And I want to let you get onto that, the question about what Trump is doing in trumping the Fed, but I can't help but stop and ask here, this is not a new phenomenon, as you pointed out. This has been evolving over a century, and I had the opportunity to attend a Ron Paul Institute conference in Washington, D.C. not that long ago, and there's going to be another one this weekend, I understand, and got to hear Ron Paul himself speak. And both Ron Paul and his son Rand Paul have been quite outspoken in Congress about ending the Fed, or at least auditing the Fed, but their pleas have seemed to have fallen on deaf ears year after year, decade after decade. Can you give us any insight into that? You certainly mentioned that the Fed itself is threatened by that if it were to happen, and so have disallowed it. But why, at least, hasn't the Congress rallied around that? How, what's the relationship there? Why a Congress hasn't shown the spine to force an audit of the Fed or ending the Fed up till now?
Because the leadership of both parties has been establishment is the polite term, but it means that they are owned and guided and controlled by the ruling elite. I'm talking about the global elite that owns the Fed, that owns the other central banks of other countries, that owns the network that controls all the central banks. That is the very powerful cabal that controls the politics of our country. Once they got the Fed in, of course that's the way they got the Fed in the first place, and they got it in at Christmas time. Think about Obamacare. I mean, it rolled in right before Christmas time, and I think there's historical evidence to the effect that they didn't even have a quorum. But they adopted the thing. Once they got it in, they had the bit in their teeth. I think, frankly, they kept the Fed in the wings in terms of the actions taken to cause the Great Depression. The Fed was not the primary actor there. It was the president, both presidents, both Hoover and, but primarily FDR. They took direct actions entirely sufficient to make certain the Great Depression happened. It was a planned thing, pursuant to a written description of the plan, which is still in effect, by the way. It's a plan to destroy the middle class completely. They declared in 1901 through a scrivener that wrote out their plan for them. It was a little book that was not noticed by anybody except the academics who are attuned to the wishes of the ruling elite. And it described the plan as being one that we must take action now to go back to the two-class system that has withstood the test of time, the two classes being the rulers and the serfs or slaves who served them. And this thing has gotten out of hand. The middle class has become much too strong and much too large. They've gotten the idea that they're even entitled to have something to say about the way they're ruled. Democracy is a great gray mass that we've got to stamp out now. And we've got to do this by the year 2000. We've got to learn how to poison the people of the abyss that we no longer need as our servants. That was their plan, and they said in order to do that, they had to take actions to destroy the fabric of society, talking about all of Western society, completely. And they named the types of people that needed to be poisoned or exterminated. They called them the blacks, the whites, the brownskins, the dirty-skinned whites, the Jews, and so forth. It was a very ugly kind of thing that you'd think if it came anywhere close to the public eye, it would have caused the author to be driven from any place in civilization. But instead, he was invited, he was immediately made famous, made very respectable in academic circles both in Europe and the United States. He was invited to the palaces of Europe. He was invited to the White House of Teddy Roosevelt on the arm of East Coast intellectuals, including Margaret Sanger. He came out of Teddy Roosevelt's reception in his honor, saying that this president is the human demigod of whom I have dreamed. And that man is H.G. Wells, a Britisher who grew up in poor circumstances. Obviously, I don't know. There's history about his parentage. He grew up in very poor circumstances, but somehow was able to go to good schools and became a man of literature and began writing horror stories and science fiction. But his claim to fame as a great academic man of literature was that little book referred to by shorthand as Anticipations, published in 1901. It doesn't really get started until about a third of the way in, which I think the first third was to disguise what's behind it. But he laid out the entire manifesto of how it was to be done. The shadow government, the central bank, the control of publishers of books. We can't have books around that put out these ideas that people need and shouldn't be exposed to. They would have the shadow government called the New Republic. It just happened to be a magazine. Happened about 20 years later that has been in existence ever since. But another aspect was a graduated income tax on the earnings of the middle class. But charitable trusts to protect the wealth of the ruling elite and all those who abide by their views and help them in their quest to do what they're going to do to the middle class. And it's been that way right down, the playbook has been right down the line all the way since then. There's a letter, for example, I've laid out all this in my book, The Fruits of Graft. I identify every action taken by FDR and Hoover to do the Great Depression. Hoover did it by 3 acts to get it started, that he just allowed himself to be rolled on. He didn't really instigate them, but he knew his party apparently wanted them, and so he just let it happen, though he admitted later that he knew it to be wrong. But FDR went straight for the jugular and was the operating force. And I don't reveal until late in my book that on the other side of the world, in a gulag, well, actually in Lubyanka prison. An operative of the ruling elite, formerly working for Stalin, who had been imprisoned and sentenced to death, was interrogated, and he discussed how both Roosevelts in effect, were highly important operatives of the ruling elite.
For those of our viewers who haven't had a chance to hear any of your stories, they can either order your book, The Fruits of Graft, and it's also the link to how to order it, guys. If you go back and look under Wayne Jett's name in our Reluctant Preppers archives, you'll find that we have 5 sessions with him, The Fruits of Graft, parts 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and it brings us right up to the current date. So there's a lot of history there. There's a lot of real sobering and chilling facts that are heavily documented with all kinds of footnotes and original sources and that sort of thing. So really encourage people to check that out. I had taken us back earlier, and I'd like to bring you back to where we were on the verge of talking about, but before we leave this, just now you mentioned in passing that part of this manifesto from H.G. Wells was the control of the press, or the publishing of books to only have approved thoughts being out there in the minds of the populace. Made me think chillingly about the last couple of months. We've seen a number of high-profile and independent news sources being snuffed out through official, either through YouTube or through Twitter or others, shutting down people's accounts who are becoming too outspoken, giving people alternative views of that they could marching out of step to the mainstream media. And so in other words, it's still very much in effect today in the age of the internet, which should be a freeing source of being able to get more voices out there. But it seems that there's a huge pressure of consolidation to these mega players and elite in the even the new media. But back to your original provocative title that we started this from, is Trumping the Fed. I had arrested you earlier. If you could go ahead and have at it with telling us what in specific you see Donald Trump doing that indicates that he's serious about making some real actions against the Fed and the unfair dominance that's had on the American people.
Well, thank you for getting me back on that.
Sure.
The main thing, or one clear example, I think, convincing evidence to me, his attention to tariffs is for a specific reason. It is to balance our current account and foreign trade. Our current account balance up to Donald Trump was negative $800 billion per year. You cannot have a sound currency in that circumstance. That is why we have had a currency that has been every year devalued in order to keep putting out more, in order to sort of more or less pay the bills. If you have to settle your account every year in your foreign account balance, if we had $800 billion in the negative, that means we have to send $800 billion worth of gold abroad in order to pay our bills. That's the way you have a sound currency. That simply cannot be the case when you go to a sound currency. He is moving with tariffs to stabilize our current account, not for the purpose of shutting down foreign trade, quite to the contrary. He's not trying to stop foreign trade as occurred back in Smoot-Hawley days, 1930. But he can put out a threat to have tariffs of a certain size, and he bargains, and he's already been reaching bargains on those things. He wouldn't be doing that if he were going to continue with the same pattern that the Fed has, which is just printing more money and keep it going for a while longer, so that he will get through his presidency like others have, and he won't be blamed for the final crash. So he's giving this attention to balancing that current account so we can get somewhere close to zero, that is an equal flow, inflow and outflow, and we wouldn't be bankrupted with the first year or two of a new currency. And if we're bankrupted in the first year or two of a new currency, that currency is going to go to zero real quickly. You see, it can't print the money and have people keep acting like it's okay. So when you have a president spending that much capital and time and attention to something like tariffs, it is for the purpose of moving to a sound currency. I think that I could probably come up with other matters of that nature to indicate his discussions with others. There have been reports of, I'm sure he must know, as most of the world knows, it's been available on the internet here in this country, that the BRICS nations are very much far along the line of going to a gold-backed currency.
Right.
Not necessarily a currency to begin with, but what's called gold-backed notes to be used in international commerce. Countries want to be paid for their national production with gold, rather than with dollars that turn out to be valueless, and they all see it coming. The BRICS nations, I think you know where those, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and many others have said a me too with them that we'll go with you as soon as you have something that works. And so the point is that pressure from the other countries is not going to let up. And we're going to have to be in a position to do business with them with currency that they're willing to take. And I'm sure the president knows that and understands that we've got to move to that basis. Plus the fact that I'm convinced there's much evidence that he is moving against the ruling elite globally. And you don't leave them with the Fed as one of their primary weapons when you're going to take them out of business. So I believe that the best chance of ending the Fed is to uproot their owners first, the ones that have occupied us, conquered us, and take them out in their home bases. Then you can move to a currency under a rational situation. And I think that, in short, is what's coming. I don't mean to be too long-winded in expressing those things, but that, I think, is the kind of scenario that we're seeing. And I see all kinds of evidence that the president is not just talking some people are saying, yeah, it's so slow, there's nothing happening. So,
right.
As you well know, if you look in the right places, there's all kind of information, and there is a lot happening, and it's happening every day. There is, in many respects, a hot war going on, and one that may be the most important in history, if it is directed at the centers of power that I think it is and ought to be, which would be the home bases and the power positions of the ruling elite. And give some. We can talk about all kinds of evidence, but I'm sure your listeners, your audience, would have most likely seen by now pictures of one or two more missiles fired in circumstances that indicate that they were fired at Air Force One with the president in it. And in those circumstances, yes, these are very serious times. And so far, those who have put the plan together for how this is going to be taken, the powers that have ruled the world for centuries are going to be taken down. Their evil is going to be stopped. We haven't even gotten into the real types of evil apart from economic, but those are very real, and they're real concerns, not to be overstated in any way, put subordinate to the straight money things. There are there are great evils being perpetrated on the world and the innocent people and our children that have got to be stopped. And I think it's happening.
So you mentioned specifically tariffs to balance the budget so that you don't bleed gold once you switch to a sound money policy. But in order to, you mentioned another thing is by necessity needing to, in your design, end the Fed so that the powers that be don't have that as a tool against you when the time comes. But if the leaders of Congress are either operatives of the powers that be, or also people have said, look at the appointees that Trump has made to his financial advisors and that sort of thing since becoming president. They say he's putting in picking from the big banks to fill his cabinet, that sort of thing. So, well, how does that show evidence of any kind of foretelling that there's going to be able to be a successful move against the Fed?
Well, I don't think I would be much benefit in trying to guess at the tactics of the president, because I'm not inside. But I certainly give him great credit and the people around him for knowing what they need to do. There are certainly cliches of keep your enemies close or your friends close, but your enemies closer. Sometimes you have to have people inside the tent so that you control them somewhat, and sometimes you have to make compromises. But nevertheless, I'm still of the view that the plan that I've seen so far is I've seen nothing like it in my lifetime to indicate the kinds of planning, the kinds of actions taken, the kinds of recognition of both strategic purposes and tactical designs to make it all work and come together at the right time. Very complex. I'm not a chess player, but the people who have done the plan are, and I think very good at it. And I think there are good information sources that are already beginning to rattle the mainstream media and shake their timbers in terms of their ability to control the narrative out in the country. Many more people are getting informed, I hope, through such things as our discussions today. But I feel in many respects, I'm an observer and a reporter, but in terms of decision maker or insider, not. But we all have our responsibilities in terms of getting information out. I know that you and your audience understand that very well.
Well, we are trying to share what we can, and so let me take it the next step then is let's just imagine that your hypothesis is correct, that these actions mean what they may mean, and that these things are going to go in directions they haven't gone for a century. What do you think are some prudent steps that an ordinary person could do? Because you actually introduced that about a half hour ago. You said, let's talk about what the impacts are on the individual of the Fed existing and what they've done to our money and so on. So if these things unravel and get put back together, what should the average person consider doing now to make sure that they aren't sitting there holding a wheelbarrow full of worthless paper when that time comes?
Well, I would say that I'm sure your audience has heard about as much as I can suggest already, but the paper money is necessary for the time being, but to the extent you can, I would say I certainly think precious metals are one efficient way of holding assets. Land, if you're in a position to care for it and know what you're buying and things of that sort and make sound decisions, is another. Those are things for people with substantial assets. But food and shelter, water, safe places for your family and children and so forth, those are all important things. and looking ahead to the kinds of things. I'm sure these problems, these issues, are very much on the minds of those trying to carry out the plans for this change that we're talking about. I think what we do not want is so much delay and with the Fed's, with the change in the Fed and the currency, that the currency is allowed to go worthless. Because that is going to then take some real rebuilding time that was going to make things very hard to simply get past the abyss or the gap and get back on track. And I feel sure that they're doing as much as they can to try to get to that position, while at the same time they're making the best decisions they can on removing these levers of power that are very much still arrayed against us at this time. So all of that is a big job. I think a lot of work has been done and is being done on it. I think we're going to see a good deal more action this week, this month, before the election and after the election. And so, that's just my opinion, but I make it known simply on the basis that I try to watch these things, and I've looked enough at the history of past government actions and the way they have conducted themselves in the past. And I think it gives me some way of judging what's going on now. And that's why I try as much as I can to get my book out, to get more people aware of how we've been lied to over the years, and to get them on a path that has a different worldview and what it is that has happened to us and our government. So that's my opinion about it.
Well, we've been talking with Wayne Jett. He is the author of The Fruits of Graft, Great Depressions Then and Now. He is also the founder of ClassicalCapital.com. He's been with us here on Reluctant Preppers talking to us about trumping the Fed. Wayne, as always, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your views and your century-long look into more than a century-long look into the past and all the research that you've done in bringing that to the present for us so that we can try to make some sense out of it and be aware and prepared of where we're headed next. And thank you for joining us here on Reluctant Preppers.
Thanks a lot, Duncan.